My friend, what is history if not the shadow of truth? And what is truth in martial arts if not the manifestation of human potential? Today, I speak to you not as an instructor of methods, but as a fellow seeker on an endless path. The history of Kung Fu, as most know, it is like a beautiful artwork that has been framed incorrectly. The beauty captivates, yet the frame distorts its actual meaning. When I hear humans speak about this history, they often recall tales of mystical monks, secret scrolls, and superhuman skills. They seek consolation in these beliefs. Legends are easier to understand than the raw intricacy of truth. Listen carefully. The most hazardous illusion in martial arts is not trickery by others, but self-deception. When we love the past without questioning it, we lock ourselves in a prison made by our own devotion. The actual masters throughout history were not people who treasured traditions like precious relics. They were ones who smashed restrictions to reveal new possibilities. History is not a temple to be visited on holidays. It is a foundry where understanding is pounded into wisdom again and again, generation after generation. The stories and the story of Kung Fu is not a straight line from origin to present. It is a living spiral where each turn both recognizes what came before and exceeds its constraints. Individuals approach the study of martial history by gathering names and dates, by remembering lineages and cataloging forms. This is like studying the flight of an eagle by collecting its fallen feathers. You may know the components, but you will never comprehend the substance of its flight. The ancient masters did not receive perfection. They pursued effectiveness within their time and environment. Their talent was not in unchanging systems, but in their relentless research into the nature of battle and human movement. The greatest honor we can show them is not to preserve their replies, but to continue their questions. When you look at history through eyes obscured by unthinking devotion, you perceive only what was. When you look with clarity and purpose, history becomes a mirror reflecting not only what was but what could be. The past masters do not require disciples who mimic their forms. They require inheritors who embody their spirit of discovery. Therefore, I invite you to join me now in studying simply the facts of Kung Fu history, but its beating heart, the eternal desire to comprehend ourselves through the language of action, the continual debate between human potential and the difficulties that reveal it. Let us begin with the name Kung Fu itself, a term that carries within its misreading the seeds of greater perplexity. When Westerners hear Kung Fu, they think immediately of punches, kicks, and organized shapes. But this essential interpretation is already a departure from truth. In Cantonese Gang Fu, or in Mandarin Gong Fu, does not refer directly to martial arts. The word signifies expertise attained through lengthy practice and dedicated work. One can have Kung Fu in calligraphy, in poetry, in gastronomy, in every field where mastery shows through devoted refining. It is the attribute of excellence earned from perseverance, not the action itself. This grammatical error is considerably more significant than a simple mistranslation. It demonstrates how we have degraded a vital concept about human development into a single category of physical processes. We have taken a philosophy of achievement and reduced it to a set of battle ways. The container has been misunderstood for what it traded development into contains. When I originally began my martial journey as a young man in Hong Kong, I too got ensnared in this mistake. I assumed that Kung Fu was something you possessed once you had studied enough tactics, enough forms. I collected motions and ways like treasures, expecting their accumulation will find equal to mastery. This was my first and perhaps most limiting illusion. It was only through years of training, inquiry, and careful thought when I learned to realize the phrase's actual dimensions. This revelation transformed everything about my relationship with martial arts. I found that Kung Fu was not an achievement with an ultimate destination, but a character of one's interaction with whatever discipline you perform. It is not what you know, but how you have come to know it. Investigate this distinction carefully. Chinese martial arts were historically dubbed Wu, meaning war arts. However, the quality of development through those arts was Kung Fu. One was the vessel, one was the process of filling it, but even this distinction fails to express the dynamic nature of real Kung Fu, which continually grows the vessel. Even as it fills it, this inaccuracy in comprehending the phrase represents a deeper conceptual issue we create. about martial arts history. Just as we have mistaken the quality of development for the activities itself, we have often misunderstood the particular styles of martial arts throughout history. Its basic goal and values, think of the martial traditions of China, not as set styles to be kept in amber, but as continual inquiries, investigations into the nature of conflict, of efficient movement, of strategy, of the link between mind and body. Various investigations have taken diverse forms in different ages, reacting to different problems, yet its essence transcends any particular set of approaches in my own journey. This knowledge released me. I stopped chasing the real version of martial arts styles as if they were items to be found. I began instead to examine what difficulties the old masters were striving to address and how their solutions can guide my own explorations. This move from collecting answers to continuing questions changed not merely how I trained, but how I perceived the underlying history of what we now call Kung Fu. Thus, while we explore this past together, remember that we are not simply following the growth of fighting tactics, we are investigating how generations of practitioners have handled the fundamental challenges of combat and self-development, each built upon and occasionally departing from what came before. Their Kung Fu was not simply in their skills, but in their process of the wisdom. Discovery, and it is that process, not only its goods, that symbolizes the true legacy we inherited. Now let us tear away the shroud of mythology and look into the original origins of what we now call Chinese martial arts. The romantic tales speak of enlightened monks and divinity inspiration, yet the real actuality emerges from something far more universal: human necessity. The earliest combat methods in China did not come from spiritual insight, but from the ruthless practicality of survive. When we analyze ancient military treatises like the Sun Bin Bing, distant from approximately 370 BC, we find lengthy explanations not of mystical energy cultivation, but of battlefield tactics, weapon use, and training methods meant to create efficient warriors. These were not aesthetic pursuits, but real answers to existential challenges. China's history has been marked by cycles of unity and disintegration, of invasion and rebellion. Each moment of instability created settings where martial skills meant the difference between life and death. During the Warring States period, when 7 kingdoms struggled for supremacy, martial development accelerated not through meditation, however, with the crucible. Continuous warfare tactics that failed faded together with those who used them. What survived did so because it worked. This hard truth stands in stark contrast to the sanitized histories commonly portrayed today. The early masters were not calm sages, delivering wisdom from mountain retreats. Many were military officers, bodyguard guards, rebels, or plain folk battling to safeguard their towns. Their concerns were immediate and practical: how to beat an armed opponent, how to survive when outnumbered, how to train fighting skills, efficiently consider the socio-political dynamics that shaped these advances. When the general people were disallowed to carry weapons over several dynasties, unarmed combat ways flourished not as spiritual practices, but as essential responses to when Mongol invaders threatened with their superior cavalry and archery. Chinese fighting methods devised particular responses to these risks. Each political reality created distinct martial concerns, demanding specific solutions. The evidence from archaeological findings, military manuals, because historical documents indicate something fundamental about early Chinese martial arts. They were extremely direct and focused totally on effectiveness. The movements were not supposed to be attractive or to reflect philosophical concepts. They were developed to work under pressure, to be learned fast, and to provide actual advantages in battle. Even the training method techniques reflected this practical attitude before the grandiose solo forms that many identify with Kung Fu today. Training concentrated on partner drills, conditioning exercises, and simulated battle. The goal was functional skill, not aesthetic perfection. When we investigate past military examinations, we find testing of strength, speed, and fighting ability, not appraisal of how nicely a solo style was executed. In my personal studies and practice this concept of martial, my approach was impacted by origins. The innovators behind varied fighting systems weren't aiming to make art, they were just trying to solve problems. They learned that following tradition doesn't always lead to the best solutions. Independence to discover, try, lose, and improve upon. Maybe it wasn't rigid conformity to patterns that made martial arts effective, but rather this pragmatic outlook. This perspective challenges people who consider martial arts as basically cultural products or spiritual practices. While these dimensions eventually existed, they were secondary developments. We risk preserving the exterior of tradition without preserving its substance when we lose sight of its original purpose, which was combat efficacy. To understand how fighting systems evolved differently across China's regions, we must examine this essential concept. Northern techniques, with their concentration on long-range kicking methods, reflected the open landscape and the influence of cavalry warfare styles of the South, with their heavy stances and close-range hand movements, were reactions to the unique constraints of urban life and naval combat, rather than arbitrary choices in aesthetics. What fascinates me most about these historical origins is not the particular tactics that emerged, but rather the process by which they were refined, the readiness to confront reality head-on, to test approaches against difficult opponents, and to change according to outcomes rather than biases. That approach in today's world, it would be wise to reclaim the original martial spirit, which was not about preserving forms, but about overcoming obstacles. This unwavering pragmatism is the true foundation of martial excellence. It wasn't about being trendy, but more about knowing how to use your talents effectively in different situations. When we comprehend this, we can explore the rich historical legacy of Chinese martial arts, not as a museum to conserve, but as a workshop where the effort of refining and adaptation continues with each generation. What changed these pragmatic fighting strategies become deep methods of self-cultivation. This is possibly the most fascinating part of Chinese martial arts history, how combat skills became vehicles for intellectual study and personal transition. As Chinese culture progressed and times of relative stability, the martial arts came to incorporate and reflect the main philosophical systems of the Chinese culture. This was not merely adornment given to fighting techniques. It was a significant reconceptualization of what martial practice may represent for human development. Confucianism, with its emphasis on social harmony and correct relationships, coupled martial arts training with ethical dimensions. The concept of Wu-Dai martial virtue arose as practitioner realized that physical power without ethical constraint was perilous, and ultimately self-defeating combat skill become inseparable from character development. The martial artist was expected to display virtues of loyalty, righteousness, love, and wisdom, not simply combat effectiveness. I have witnessed how this Confucian influence generated a framework where martial arts become a tool for building the ideal person, someone who could fight effectively, but opted to use this skill wisely and justly. This transformed what may have remained ordinary combat methods into a path of character enhancement. The ultimate purpose of training was not to vanquish others, but to perfect oneself simultaneously. Taoist philosophy offered significant notions about naturalness and strategic intelligence to martial development, from its two principles of yielding rather than resisting directly, of using an opponent's force against them, of seeking the path of least resistance. These concepts revolutionized combat tactics. The toss concept of complementary opposites, yin and yang, provides a foundation for understanding how softness might beat hardness, how circular movement could defeat linear force. What I find most important about this twist effect is how it affected focus from pure physical power to smart application of force. The finest talent was not to overwhelm an opponent with power, but to neutralize their attack with least effort. This principle of economy, of producing most result with lowest effort, became central to advanced martial arts. It is not what you do, but about what you do not do. The needless moves you eliminate, but probably the most profound transformation comes through Chan Buddhism, understood in the West as Zen. This wasn't only about integrating meditation to fighting tactics. It was a comprehensive reconceptualization of the between mind and body. Chan Buddhism taught that dualistic thinking, separating mind from body, self from other, technique from principle, was an illusion that hindered genuine understanding. Through this lens, martial arts become a vehicle for directly seeing reality beyond conceptual thinking. Practitioner learns to act from a level of united awareness where there was no division between intention and action, between knowing and doing. This state, which the Japanese eventually dubbed mushin or no mind, signified the highest level of martial success in my own development. I began to see these philosophical dimensions were not separate from combat effectiveness, but were in reality the road to its ultimate expression. The ethical framework of Confucianism prevented the exploitation of expertise that would ultimately develop opponents and lead to downfall. The strategic wisdom of Taoism ensured victory without relying on superior power. The unified awareness of Chan Buddhism allows rapid responsiveness without the delay of conscious thought. My personal philosophy of Jundu depicts a synthesis of these traditions, not as historical objects must be maintained intact, but as notions to be interpreted and articulated according to one's particular nature. From Confucianism, I adopted the commitment to sincerity and self-cultivation from Taoism. I embrace non-sea conflict and the water-like quality of flexibility from Chan Buddhism. I incorporated direct experience beyond the limitations of styles and forms. What we witness in this philosophical revolution is truly astounding. Combat techniques evolved for survival became platforms for probing the innermost problems of human existence. How should we live? How may we integrate with natural principles? How may we transcend our restrictive self-concept? These questions found expression not just merely in literature and teachings, but in the lived experience of martial training. This blend of philosophical depth with martial effectiveness marks one of China's greatest cultural achievements. Nevertheless, we must realize that this shift did not make martial arts less useful. It made them more profound, while keeping their functional essence. The philosophical dimensions were not substitutes for military combat effectiveness, but expansions of it into broader domains of human growth. Throughout Chinese history, the great improvements in martial arts come not from those who kept traditions unaltered, but from those who responded to new challenges. This is a crucial understanding that has been largely forgotten in current times. The true tradition of martial arts is not preservation, but innovation. Observe what happened. China experienced
Mongol invaders throughout the Sung, Yuan dynasties. The Mongols were physically larger, rode mighty horses, and employed terrible archery, considering the contemporary Chinese martial systems, created mostly for infantry warfare, against similar opponents, unexpectedly encountered an existential dilemma. How did the masters of that era respond? Not by keeping steadfastly to known procedures, but by inventing new together. They devised tactics, stressing redirection rather than direct opposing key point, striking rather than overwhelming force, evasive footwork rather than stiff stances. These innovations weren't betrayals of tradition. They were tradition, acting as it was supposed to adapt to meet current and pressing issues when firearms came to dominate battlefields during the Ming Dynasty, making many conventional armament obsolete. Martial artists again faced a dilemma: retain methods produced for outmoded contexts, or adopt the most visionary masters' selected evolution, altering focus from battlefield applications to personal self-defense, internal development, and enhanced skill manifestation. This wasn't a corruption of martial arts. Nevertheless, there required reinventing the famous systems things today were not given down from heaven, completely formed. They were built by individuals responding creatively to the problems of their day. Xing's founder, Gage, refined his arts, linear, explosive power to breach the armor, and formations of opposing soldiers, Wing Chan's stringent economic actions, were purportedly meant to overcome the advantages of larger, stronger opponents. Tang Quan's nuanced, yielding, and redirection notions evolved as a clever response to the constraints of confronting force. With force, this historical pattern tells something significant. The true masters were not preservationists, they were innovator. They honored their predecessors, not by reiterating their answers, but by continuing their process of inquiry and adaptability. They knew that martial excellence is not static. It is alive, constantly growing in response to new situations and difficulties. I got to this understanding from both historical studies and personal experience when I began to doubt the limitations of typical training approaches. Many accused me of disrespectful heritage, but my deeper study of martial history proved that I was actually embracing the true spirit of tradition, the spirit of adaptation and evolution that had always characterized the great masters. What we call traditional martial arts were once innovative innovations. The forms and procedures now held as sacrosanct were once radical divergence from what came before. The founders of these systems were not looking backward. They were handling the difficulties of their present moment using innovative intelligence. Their innovations became traditions only after their deaths, when successive generations began to maintain rather than continue their path of evolution. This insight impacted my perception of my own role. In martial arts history, I learned that the highest respect I could give to the great of the past was not to copy their answers, but to embody their questioning spirit, not to preserve their solutions, but to continue their inquiry, not to be bound by their conclusions, but to be inspired by their approach in developing Gundu. Understood I was not discarding tradition, but reconnecting with its deeper essence, its adaptable, responsive nature, when I urged absorbing what is useful, rejecting what is useless, and adding what is distinctively your own. I was describing a principle that the greatest masters throughout history had always followed, albeit rarely expressed. Clearly, this concept of martial history as constant adaptation, rather than static preservation, liberates us. It means we don't need to choose between appreciating the past and addressing the present. The genuine tradition of martial arts is the tradition of progress itself, of handling each new issue with the same inventive intellect that inspired the founders of numerous styles. Glance closely at any martial system that has endured, and you will discover not absolute orthodoxy, but clever adaptability. The systems that clever adaptability, the systems that failed to evolve eventually become irrelevant or ornamental, preserved like insects in amber, visible but no longer alive. The systems that continued to adapt remained important, effective, and meaningful across changing situations and generations. The animal styles of Chinese martial arts have gripped minds for centuries. Tiger crane, snake, mantis dragon. These systems look to be exact imitations of animal movements. However, this superficial comprehension ignores its depth. Essence, the ultimate brilliance of animal styles, rests not in mimicking, but in fundamental when the ancient master heirs spotted the snake, they weren't only mimicking its crawling motion. They were sensing something considerably deeper and noteworthy, the snake's ability to create power from a condition of total relaxation, to strike with precision from stillness, to use its entire body as an integrated unit. The physical resemblance between snake techniques and true snake motions is substantially less relevant than these core notions. Consider the mantis technique. A simplistic approach implies practitioners are merely copying the insect's unique forearms and sharp motions, yet the genuine insight of mantis boxing is about strategic concepts, the notion of simultaneous defense and assault, the economics of trapping methods, the psychological temporal timing of intercepting an opponent at the moment of their commitment. These notions transcend sheer mimicking. Tiger style wasn't respected because practitioners could plausibly imitate a tiger's appearance. It was designed to incorporate specific power generation technologies, the synchronization of breath with severe muscular contraction, the structural alignment that allows maximal force transmission. The psychological attribute of decisive commitment to action. These concepts are relevant, regardless, matter whether the approaches visually resemble a tiger in the crane style. The premise of balance, mixed with precision, hitting matters significantly more than whether practitioners stand on one leg. Like the bird, the crane's capacity to sustain structural integrity during extending reach to recover position, after stretching to strike with focused accuracy. These are the meaningful principles that transcend mere mimicking, this divide between mimicry. The major extraction highlights something basic. Regarding martial development, the best masters weren't designing systems based on surface appearances, but on functional principles observed in nature. They employed animals as conceptual frameworks to organize and impart complex biomechanical and strategic concepts in my own training. This insight impacted how I approached these established systems rather than asking, how can I make my actions look more like this? Animal, I began, asking what useful principle is this animal embodying and how can I assimilate that principle regardless of externals. Formed from the snake, I took the notion of relaxed power, the capacity to generate force without telegraphing intention via preliminary tension from the crane. I learned the idea of accuracy over force, realizing that a precisely delivered weaker force often achieves more than a powerful but imprecise one. From the tiger, I combined the principle of committed activity, total psychological investment in each movement without reservation. This principle-centered approach liberates us from fixating on artistic appearances while allowing us to recognize the significant lessons hidden within traditional systems. It enables us to go beyond the restrictions of literal interpretation while keeping the function wisdom. These styles contain the beast styles, weren't supposed to be things we wear or motions. We pretend they were sophisticated, conceptual frameworks created to transmit complicated principles. Utilizing simple analogies, when we grasp this, we progress from being collectors of tactics to students of principles, from outward mimicry to internal comprehend. Standing throughout Chinese history, martial arts have followed a fascinating rhythm, a cycle of innovation, followed by codification, then stagnation, and finally revolution. Comprehending this pattern shows not merely the past, but also the existing problems and future potential of martial development. When we examine the historical record closely, we may see this rhythm playing out frequently throughout eras of instability and conflict. Martial arts evolved fast, new techniques arose, old approaches were tried and refined, and pragmatic effectiveness was the key priority. The martial artists of these periods were not preservationists, but creators responding creatively to acute risks and problems. Then a society stabilized, eased, and urgent hazards receded. A time of codification would commence. The improvements that proven beneficial was systematized, catalogued, and arranged into coherent instructional techniques. Hoist of essential aim maintained hard-won knowledge and made it transmissible to future generations. What had been the personal expressions of inventive individuals become structured structures that might be taught more widely. Nevertheless, this process of codification had within it the seeds of stagnation as generations passed. What were once dynamic, breathing responses to actual combat circumstances gradually converted into ritualized patterns and predefined patterns. The original context and aim of movements became hidden. Students began to focus on copying the exterior form of approaches rather than learning their essential principles and application. This paralysis manifested in numerous ways. training practices that were formerly supposed to develop genuine fighting talents become increasingly abstract and distant from aggressive actual forms that were originally mnemonics for fighting methods became performances assessed on aesthetic standards. Rather than utilitarian effectiveness, the inquisitive spirit that had inspired innovation was replaced by reverence for tradition and acceptance of inherited wisdom. The most distressing element of this stagnation was how it inverted the relationship between form and function in the innovative phase. Function-dictated form techniques were determined by their efficacy in solving genuine combat difficulties. But in the stagnation period, form began. To govern function, practitioners started with preset movements and then sought excuses for them, rather than starting with problems and building solutions. Yet, the story doesn't stop with stagnation. Throughout history, visionary individuals have evolved who understood the limitations of calcified traditions and established new phases of innovation. These revolutionary leaders often encountered fierce pushback from established authorities, but eventually reinvigorated martial arts by reconnecting them with its practical origins and innovative spirit. I noticed this tendency not simply in the past, but in the martial arts environment of my own time. Many schools have become museums, maintaining skills without understanding priorities. Conformity over utility. Pupils were taught what to think rather than how to think, what to do rather than why to do it. The inquisitive spirit, essential to martial progress, had been replaced with thoughtless acceptance of established forms and techniques. This thought strongly inspired my attitude of constant progress. I came to recognize that the greatest respect I could offer to martial tradition was not to regard it as a final result, but as a continual process. The genuine tradition of martial arts is not the preservation of forms, but the continuance of that evolutionary spirit that has always defined its most vital phases. When I spoke of being formless, less, like water, I was conveying this idea of martial evolution. Water doesn't stick to one shape, it adjusts to its container, it flows around obstacles, it finds the path of least resistance. This is not only a lyrical metaphor, but a fundamental principle that has always controlled true martial evolution. The most deadly pitfall in martial arts is not ignorance, but the illusion of knowledge, the belief that the systems we have gained form the ultimate word, rather than waypoints in a continuous journey. When we mistake the map for the area, when we confuse the teaching approach for the reality it points toward, we get caught in forms that may no longer suit their intended function. This cycle of innovation, codification, stagnation, and revolution teaches us something profound. Martial arts are not static relics, but living traditions that must always refresh themselves to remain vital. The health of any martial system may be assessed not by how faithfully it retains its history, but by how effectively it addresses present difficulties while keeping open to future evolution. The history of Chinese martial arts demonstrates a remarkable capacity for innovation across shifting dynasties given socio-cultural settings. What originated primarily as battlefield tactics, modified many times as the context and objective of combat developed over Chinese history during the Han Dynasty. Martial arts were mostly military specialties, focusing on preparing troops for coordinated warfare. The strategies emphasized weapon use, formation, combat, and battlefield effectiveness. Individual expression was subservient to collective military necessity. The martial artist was first, and primarily a combatant safeguarding state interests. As we advance through the Tang and Song dynasties, we see martial arts beginning to develop civilian applications alongside their military, because as urban centres expanded and trade flourished, personal self-defence became increasingly major martial arts emerged to adapt to this setting, concentrating more on unarmed using single fighting rather than coordinated warfare and disagreements in enclosed locations rather than open battlefields. The Mongol conquest during the Yuan dynasty sparked another change, when Chinese were forbidden from possessing firearms, or because for military training, martial arts, shifted covert training techniques had to be camouflaged as health activities or folk dances. What might appear to be a restriction really enhanced innovation. Practitioners produced approaches that may be done individually and surreptitiously, yet still may be done individually and surreptitiously, yet still create true combat skill. The Ming Dynasty witnessed maybe the most significant transformation, the fusion of martial arts with academic and medical traditions. What had long been primarily combat methods grew to be seen as strategies for building health, ethical character, and spiritual insight. Thus, wasn't a rejection of martial effectiveness, but an expansion of purpose, realizing that the principles that guided effective fighting also give a knowledge for effective living. By the Qing dynasty, with the proliferation of weapons, rendering traditional warfare methods increasingly outdated on the combat martial arts underwent yet another mutation. They became vehicles for retaining cultural identity amid foreign control methods for personal growth and strategies for fostering the body-mind relationship in an increasingly me-ized world. What I find most crucial about these transformations is not that martial arts changed it. How they changed each evolution wasn't a rejection of what gone before, but a recontextualization of key concepts. To address new conditions, the outer forms shifted, but the core insights about human movement, psychology, and fighting dynamics remained significant. Throughout drastically diverse settings, this historical perspective impacted my idea of what martial arts must become in our modern times. We face difficulties unforeseen to previous generations, global mobility that puts diverse combat techniques into contact scientific understanding of human biomechanics and psychology, urban surroundings that hinder typical training techniques, legal systems that ban the deployment of fighting techniques. In such a world, martial arts cannot stay static museums of old technology. They must once again adapt their forms while maintaining their important insights. The modern martial artist isn't prepared for medieval battlefield circumstances or imperial court duels. We prepare for modern self-defense scenarios, for personal growth in a technology age, for psychological equilibrium in a demanding world. This necessary alteration doesn't degrade tradition. It continues tradition's most significant aspect, its adaptation to changing conditions. The martial arts that survive and prosper in the modern world will be those who can separate their timeless concepts from their time-bound forms, keeping what remains important while innovating to solve current issues. One of the most persistent misconceptions about Chinese martial arts is that they arose in splendid isolation, untouched by outside influences. This narrative of culture purity is not merely historically inaccurate. It obscures of the most intriguing qualities in martial arts evolution. The huge interchange of combat experience across cultural borders throughout history. China has participated in constant cultural exchange with surrounding civilizations. The Silk Road didn't merely transmit items between East and West, It transferred notions, such martial concepts. When we explore historical records and archaeological evidence, we discover evident hints of cross-cultural influences in weapon designs, battle tactics and training systems, investigate the linkages between Indian martial traditions and Chinese systems. The historical data reveals considerable exchange between both cultures. Abilities from Indian wrestling and staff techniques appear to have affected specific Chinese forms. The idea of key point hitting displays remarkable parallels throughout these traditions that cannot be exploring the link between Chinese martial arts and those of Central Asia shows another level of this exchange. The horsemanship and archery of Mongol, Turkic, and other steppe peoples both challenged and inspired Chinese fighting skills. When faced with mounted warriors from the North, Chinese martial systems have to adjust and include new strategies to tackle these difficulties. This wasn't a corruption of indigenous traditions, but an evolution driven by cross-cultural encounter. Even inside what we now call China, diverse regions and ethnic groups developed distinct fighting approaches that inspired each other. The martial arts of the Norn plains, with their concentration methods and mobility, cross-pollinated with southern systems that emphasized stability and close-range fighting. Hoka martial arts shared concepts with neighboring traditions, while preserving their distinct character. Japan, Korea, Okinawa, and Southeast Asian nations all participated in this ongoing exchange of martial information with China weapon designs, training methods, and tactics. Concepts flowed over these porous cultural borders in multiple directions. When we evaluate the staff tactics of Southeast Asia alongside Southern Chinese ways, or compare various Japanese weapon arts with their Chinese equivalents, the evidence of mutual effect becomes obvious. What I find most significant about this historical truth is how it undermines the narrative of purity that many martial traditions have built. The power of Chinese martial arts never arose from isolation. Absorb, integrate, and transform diversity influences like a mighty river, fed by many rivers. Chinese martial arts become richer by each cultural exchange adopting valuable aspects while keeping their basic ideas. In my own approach, I embrace this multicultural martial heritage rather than denying it. I research systems from different cultures: Wing, Chan from China, Western boxing, Filipino martial arts, Japanese, karate, Western fencing, realizing that efficient values exist across cultural borders. This wasn't a rejection of my Chinese heritage, but an assertion of its deepest heritage, the openness to learn from all sources. The concept of cultural detachment fits a psychological craving for uncomplicated storylines and pure origins. However, it does a disservice to the convoluted, interconnected reality of martial development. The genuine history of martial arts is not one of separate parallel streams, but of a huge network of rivers and tributaries running in multiple routes, sometimes merging, sometimes diverging, but always related in a continual exchange of knowledge. When we realize this history of exchange, we free ourselves from false limits. We can honor specific cultural
traditions while acknowledging that the pursuit of martial excellence has always transcended cultural bounds. The question isn't whether a technique or philosophy comes from our past or theirs, but whether it works, whether it conveys truth, whether it leads to greater understanding. let me share with you, sounding let me share with you my personal journey through the world of martial arts, not as an example for you to follow, but as an example of how one man negotiated the delicate relationship between tradition and personal truth. My story is not autonomous from the wider history we've been studying. It is one manifestation of the eternal struggle between form and freedom, between the wisdom of the past and the obligations of the moment. I began, as many do, a young man, learning ancient skills from reputable tutors in Hong Kong. I studied Wing Chun underneath, Ipman adopting its efficient principles, its economy of motion, its thorough grasp of close-range fighting. I practiced the forms, refined the skills, sparred with classmates, following the customary path of transmission that has prevailed for generations. There was tremendous wisdom in this instruction. The precision of movement, the emphasis on center line, control. The fight from center line control, the concept of simultaneous assault and defense. Fundamental themes are vital. Regardless of style or era, my appreciation for this foundation has never waned, even as my path deviated from orthodoxy. As I continued my study and began teaching others, I encountered a rising irritation with stagnating approaches to martial arts. I saw how many schools had become closed systems, repeating patterns without entirely comprehending them, maintaining processes without evaluating them, responding concerns with, because the style mandates it rather than with practical explanations. Its rigidity contradicted everything I was taught about actual conflict. Real battling is fluid, unexpected, dynamic. It cannot be restricted within set patterns. The distance between traditional training methods and military realities became evident and disturbing to me. My results lead me to doubt not just individual approaches, but whole training paradigms. I came to appreciate how many traditional techniques, while possessing wonderful concepts, were imprisoned in cultural and historical phrases that sometimes masked rather than showed their inherent truths. The container had become more significant than what it held. This insight did not lead me to forsake tradition, but to connect with it more deeply, to examine beyond its superficial expressions to its basic principles. I wasn't concerned in disregarding the lessons of past masters, but in acquiring their own essential knowledge from cultural and historical accretions that were no longer relevant. The turning point occurred when I got a back condition that prompted me to reevaluate everything, unable to train as I had before. I had to explore new ways. This constraint became a path to liberation during my rehab. I delved thoroughly into books on various combat arts, Western boxing, wrestling, fencing, analyzing their principles rather than just their approaches. I began to notice commonalities across apparently disparate systems, essential ideas articulated. Using different cultural lenses, this validated what my historical studies had indicated, that martial excellence transcends style and culture, that there are universal laws of efficient movement and battle effectiveness that exist apart of any particular system. This led to the establishment of my philosophy of personal truth in martial arts. I came to believe that each practitioner must finally discover their own way, informed but not bound by tradition. The martial arts path is not about adhering to other norms, but rather discovering your own remark, about disclosing rather than adding. When I replied, I have no way as the approach and no limitation as the limitation, I was conveying this realizing genuine mastery doesn't come from perfecting a predetermined path, but from transcending the fundamental concept of roots from reaching beyond the limitations of style to straightforward exposition of concept. My historical research and personal discovery got entangled in a continual dialogue. The more I understood martial history as a process of adaptation and evolution rather than static preservation, the more freedom I felt to continue that progress in my own practice, and the more I investigated first-hand experience through training and combat, the more clearly I could distinguish between classic ICAL concepts that remained important and historical forms that had outlived their context. This this personal quest taught me something important about martial arts. Learning transmission involves not just a teacher transmitting techniques to a student, but a student internalizing concepts so thoroughly that they become capable of their own expressiveness. The greatest gift a teacher can provide is not a flawless imitation of their own work, but the skills for pupils to explore their own. My journey was not a rejection of history, but a different relationship with it, seeing the past not as a template to follow, but as a conversation to continue, not as an end point, but as an end point, but as a foundation, not as a constraint, but as a springboard. In this way, my personal quest became part of the very history. I was studying another turn in the spiral of martial evolution that has persisted for ages. When we look at martial arts merely as sets of skills, we miss their real essence throughout history. The greatest moments in martial progress were when practitioners moved beyond methods, principles behind them. This transcendence of the technical component indicates the larger purpose and potential of martial arts. Assess how many practitioners approach their training recording skills, gathering forms, accumulating strategies as if martial knowledge were merely an issue of number. I know hundreds of procedures they may announce as if this in itself constituted mastery, yet technical accumulation without primary center. Understanding is like amassing words without knowing grammar. You may own many components, but lack the skill to make something. Expressions from my personal experience found that true growth comes not from adding new skills, but from expanding your understanding of fundamental ideas. When I learned in Wing Chun, originally focused on understanding the skills of the system, the Tan Sabonga Lapa drills the Su Lim Tao form, but my breakthrough occurred when I began to understand the ideas. These methods included centerline control, economy of motion, simultaneous assault and defense, vulnerability to pressure. If I realized these principles, I discovered they may be stated by numerous technical variations outside the canonical movements of the style. The varied approaches were fundamentally distinctive manifestations of universal principles. This insight liberated me from technical fixation and opened the way to principle-based. Recognizing this identical tendency repeats regularly throughout martial history. Examine the legendary masters we revere: Wang Efi, Hung Dong Hong Chen, Phony Yang Luchen. What made them unique wasn't just their technical repertoire, but their thorough knowledge of concepts. They didn't merely preserve ways, they embodied principles so completely that they could transmit them spontaneously in any scenario. These masters weren't appreciated while they understood more strategies than others. They were valued because they grasped the substance behind methods, the concepts that give techniques their life and purpose. They could apply these principles in uncommon contexts, reacting instantly to unexpected difficulties. Their mastery wasn't rigorous commitment to form, but flowing expression of essence. The link between ancient masters and their innovations demonstrates this Point plainly, the founders of numerous styles weren't principally technique inventors, they were principle discoverers. They spotted patterns, connections, and concepts that transcended specific movements. The techniques they devised were vehicles for these ideals, not the principles themselves. The divide between technique and principle isn't only philosophical. It affects how we execute and perceive martial arts. When we work out with principle-concentrated awareness, every action becomes an adventure rather than a replication. Every practice session becomes discovery rather than repetition. Every difficulty becomes a chance for increased understanding rather than a test of remembered answers. My concept of martial arts as a vehicle for human potential originates from this idea. As we move beyond technical cataloging to principle, the martial arts become not just weapons of combat, but pathways for human growth. The attributes that influence successful fighting: awareness, adaptability, efficiency, harmony between goal and action, are the same principles that govern effective living. The highest manifestation of martial arts isn't technical perfection, but the synthesis of physical activity with mental clarity and spiritual freedom. The greatest masters throughout history weren't merely skilled fighters. They were folks who had used martial training as a method to fulfill their complete human. Having this viewpoint modifies how we react to the martial, past the abilities of the old masters matter less than the principles they revealed and the method by which they discovered them. Their greatest legacy isn't a database of motions, but an approach to comprehending movement itself. When we grasp this essence beyond technique, we appreciate legacy not by maintaining its forms unchanged, but by continuing its process of inquiry. We admire the masters not by reproducing their replies, but by accepting their inquiries. We grow the art not by adding to its technological inventory, but by improving our awareness of its basic principles. This principle-based system reconnects martial arts with their greatest purpose, not just teaching us how to fight, but helping us recognize who we are and what we can become beyond self-defense, beyond physical fitness, beyond cultural preservation. Lies this deep potential. Martial arts is a platform for examining human ability, for merging body, mind, and spirit, for expressing individual truth through disciplined action. As we finish our survey of martial history, I want to share with you what I feel is the ongoing legacy of this great wisdom, not as a definitive answer, but as an invitation to your own discovery. The true history of Kung Fu isn't documented in scrolls or books, or even in the forms and practices transmitted down through generations. It's recorded in the lived experience of innumerable practitioners who throughout the centuries used this skill as a method to comprehend themselves and their world. This history isn't done. It continues with each of us who interacts seriously with this path. The question we must individually answer is how to appreciate this rich heritage while remaining loyal to its innovative spirit. My answer is this: we honor the past not through preservation, but through evolution. The greatest respect we can offer to the masters who came before us isn't to freeze their creativity in time, but to keep it alive via ongoing growth and development. Remember this: the old masters didn't inherit perfection. They created effectiveness for their time. They faced their troubles. We must face ours. They found their truths. We must find ours. They weren't restricted by their predecessors. We shouldn't be restricted by them. This isn't disrespect. It's the highest kind of esteem, viewing them as pioneers rather than mere caretakers. When I look at martial history as a whole, I see not a memorial to be kept, but an ongoing human exploration, an exploration of human movement of battle, principles of the link between mind and body, of the absolute limits of human potential. Each generation has added to this exploration, adding their results, questioning prior beliefs, broadening the boundaries of what was deemed conceivable. This perspective liberates us from the burden of perfect reproduction and welcomes us into the journey of ongoing discovery. It alters our relationship with the past from one of subservience to one of conversation. We may respect the insights of prior generations while offering our own knowledge to this living tradition. My final perspective on martial history is this. Isn't a story of what was but a process that continues to be a way of discovering human potential through the link between mind, body, and soul. When viewed, this perspective, history becomes not a weight that attaches us to the past, but a foundation that supports our growth toward the future. This is the deep insight I've gotten over years of study, practice, and contemplation. The greatest martial artists throughout history weren't those who collected the most methods or maintained traditions unchanged. They were those who pierced to the key principles of human movement and fight, who conveyed the beliefs with honesty and directness, who adjusted continually to changing conditions, while retaining touch to core principles. This insight links past, present, and future in a single, continuous stream. The same principles that drove the creation of martial arts millennia ago: efficiency, directness, adaptation, harmony between purpose and action remain crucial now and will continue to lead honest practitioners in the future. The outward forms may evolve, but the underlying concepts persist as you pursue your own trip in martial arts, whether as practitioner or just as student of its history. Encourage you to approach this topic not as a museum of old relics, but as a live laboratory of human potential. Perceive oneself not as a custodian of fixed information, but as a contributor to a continuous exploration. Remember that in the end, all the techniques, all the forms, all the systems are simply various fingers pointing to the same moon, and the moon they point to is self-knowledge. Don't focus too hard on the fingers that you miss. You miss the heavenly glory. They signify the genuine core of Kung Fu beyond styles and approaches beyond histories and lineages is reflected in by knowing yourself, not as a permanent entity, but as a process of becoming, not as distinct from the environment, but as part of it, not as bound by limitations, but continually overcoming them. This is the greatest wisdom of martial history, that through this particular discipline of battle preparation, generations of practitioners have uncovered universal principles, understand human nature and human potential. When we engage with this history in its purest form, we participate in this ongoing discovery. We become not simply pupils of the past, but creators of the future. In this sense, the history of Kung Fu isn't just something we study, it's something we study, it's something we live. It's not just something we preserve, it's something we continue. Something we contribute to this living interaction with history is, I feel, the truest manifestation of appreciation for the amazing journey that carried martial arts from its ancient origins to our present moment, and that continues to evolve toward a future we aid create. Create